You've been told a story about power, the lone wolf, the one who needs no one, the INFJ or INTJ who walked away from the noise and found themselves in the silence. They called you Sigma, and maybe for the first time, you felt seen. You claimed that identity, wore it like a crown. But here's what no one told you. Sigma is both truth and trap. It's real, but it's not final. It's not the destination. It's the chrysalis. And what emerges is something else entirely. Let's start with what we know. If you're an INFJ or INTJ, chances are you've lived through this. Years of performing, masking, adapting to social structures that felt like cages, smiling through conversations that drained you, playing roles that never quite fit, until one day something broke. Maybe it was betrayal. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was just clarity, the realization that you'd been living a life that wasn't yours. And so you withdrew, not out of weakness, out of necessity. You stepped back. You watched from the outside. You built a life in the margins. And there, in that solitude, you found something precious, yourself. This is Sigma, the outsider, the observer, the one who doesn't play the game because they've seen through it. Sigma is independent, self-sufficient, unbothered by social hierarchy, comfortable in solitude, allergic to performative connection. And for a while, Sigma feels like freedom, because it is freedom. Freedom from expectations that never fit, relationships that only took, a world that demanded you be smaller than you are. Sigma saved you. Let me say that again. Sigma saved you. It gave you distance when you needed perspective. It gave you silence when you needed to hear yourself think. It gave you space when you needed to rebuild. Sigma isn't a mistake. It's a necessary stage of development. But here's what the Sigma mythology won't tell you. The chrysalis was never meant to become the cage. Because if you stay in Sigma too long, something shifts. The protection becomes a prison. The independence becomes isolation. The strategy becomes the identity. You start believing, I am the outsider. I don't need anyone. Connection is weakness. I'm different, and that means I'm alone. And here's the trap. You start defining yourself by what you've rejected, not by what you're building, not by your vision, but by what you've walked away from. This is where Sigma stops being evolution and starts being avoidance. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Sigma is still reactive. You didn't choose solitude because you transcended the need for connection. You chose it because connection felt like a threat. Sigma is sovereignty's shadow. It's freedom from, but not yet freedom to. And I know this because I've been there. That moment when you realize, wait, am I here because I'm healing or because I'm hiding? Am I protecting my energy or am I afraid to risk it? Am I choosing solitude or is solitude choosing me? The wound that drove you into Sigma, it's still there. You didn't heal it. You just built walls around it. And those walls kept you safe for a time. But now they're keeping you small, because Sigma taught you to survive alone. But survival isn't the same as sovereignty, and that's where the real journey begins. The walls that once protected you begin to glow from within, not to keep the world out, but to light the path back. So what is sovereign? Sovereign is what happens when you complete the work that Sigma began. During your withdrawal, something happened. You had distance, and distance gave you perspective. You had time, and time let you digest what happened. You had solitude, and solitude let you observe. You watched the dynamics you used to be trapped in. You studied the patterns. You metabolized the wound. And slowly, carefully, you built a map. A map of which connections drain you and which don't. What triggers your defenses, where your boundaries need to be, what you actually value versus what you were told to value. The difference between collaboration and enmeshment, when to speak and when to stay silent. You learn to read the world, not from inside the game, but from outside it. And then something shifted. You realized, I am complete, alone, not as a wound, not as a defense, as a fact. You don't need anyone. And paradoxically, that means you're finally free to choose connection. This is where sovereign begins. Because sovereign isn't about abandoning withdrawal. It's about mastering the rhythm between solitude and engagement. The Sigma stays in the cave because they're still afraid of the world. The sovereign leaves the cave when their vision calls for it and returns when it doesn't. Listen carefully. Sovereign isn't about choosing connection over solitude. It's about strategic immersion. You emerge from solitude when your vision requires collaboration, when a project needs your presence, when connection serves what you're building. And you return to solitude when you need to create, when you need to integrate, when you need to recharge. And there's no guilt in either direction. Because you've internalized the truth. You are already whole, which means every connection you make from this point forward, it's not compensation, it's not completion, it's not proof that you can be normal, it's strategic deployment. The sovereign operates from vision, not wound. They can be alone without loneliness, connect without losing themselves, enter the world without being consumed by it, withdraw without guilt or fear, both by choice, neither by compulsion. This is what integration looks like, not the ego that needs to prove it can be alone, not the persona that needs to prove it can connect, but the self that knows it can do both and chooses based on vision, not reaction. Sigma taught you the power of distance. Sovereign teaches you the mastery of rhythm, alone when vision demands depth, engaged when vision demands collaboration. Not all in, not all out, balanced, calibrated, free. The map you built during Sigma, now it's your GPS. You can read social dynamics instantly. You know when to engage, when to withdraw, when to wait. You're not guessing anymore. You have data. You have discernment. You have sovereignty. If you know Carl Jung's work, you'll recognize what I'm describing. Individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating the shadow, of moving from ego to self. For INFJs and INTJs, this journey has a specific shape. Stage 1, the wound. Social disillusionment, betrayal, exhaustion from masking. Stage 2, Sigma. Necessary withdrawal to observe, digest, and build your internal map. Stage 3, Sovereign. Integration and mastery of the rhythm between solitude and strategic engagement. Sigma is the hero's departure, the refusal of the false call, the walk into the unknown. Sovereign is the return, not back to who you were, not back to the world that wounded you, but forward, into a version of yourself that doesn't need to hide, doesn't need to perform, and doesn't need to exile itself to be free. This isn't pop psychology. This is depth psychology in modern language. And if you're ready for it, the transformation is waiting. Today, I gave you the concept, the map of the territory. But here's the thing. Sovereign doesn't look the same for INFJs and INTJs. The wound is different. The withdrawal serves a different purpose. The integration requires different work. For the INFJ, the visionary empath, with introverted intuition and extroverted feeling, you absorbed others' emotions as truth. Your wound often comes from emotional enmeshment. Your Sigma withdrawal was about closing that door, reclaiming your emotional sovereignty. And your sovereign integration, it's about learning to open that door intentionally, choosing when to attune and when to shield, mastering the rhythm of connection without losing yourself. For the INTJ, the architect visionary, with introverted intuition and extroverted thinking, you tried to optimize systems that didn't value you. Your wound often comes from competence being weaponized against you. Your Sigma withdrawal was about building your own frameworks, your own standards, and your sovereign integration. It's about strategic deployment, learning when to engage with the world's systems and when to build your own, choosing collaboration without compromising your vision. The path is different, the integration is different, the sovereignty is different. So, here's what's coming in separate, dedicated videos. First, I'll be breaking down what sovereign looks like specifically for the INFJ, the wound, the withdrawal, the integration, the strategy, how you develop the functions that turn emotional absorption into emotional mastery. Then, the INTJ path in its own video, how you recalibrate your relationship with competence and systems, how you build sovereignty when your mind is your kingdom, and beyond that, the INFP and INTP. Because this evolution isn't limited to introverted intuition. The same journey unfolds through different functions, different wounds, and different forms of sovereignty. If you're tired of being told that Sigma is the end, if you sense there's something more, if you're ready to stop surviving in isolation and start thriving in rhythm, subscribe, because this is just the beginning. Sigma was the exile. Sovereign is the return, not to the world as it is, but to yourself as you were always meant to be.